Hi, I'm Dan Estrada, and this is Engineering Ethics at NJIT. We're on Lesson 3. This will be the lecture video for this lesson. Remember, these lecture videos, I will go over, sort of give a lecture and go over and introduce all the readings for this week, highlight some of the critical themes, just to get you started on the week's material. Remember, there'll also be a weekly hangout on Tuesday that you can come join to ask questions about last week or talk about the material from this week. I've switched up the way that I'm recording this. The video from last week was really poor quality, so I hope these are getting better. I'm still learning how to do these videos, so thanks for your patience. Let's go ahead and jump into the lesson. All right, yeah, so we're on Lesson 3. Lesson 3 is our first week of learning a ethical theory. This is our first of 3 ethical theories. We're going to cover 3 ethical theories over the next couple of weeks. And this week we'll learn our first. The first is consequentialism. In a few weeks we'll learn about deontology, and then the last one is virtue ethics. But consequentialism is the first, and in some sense it's the most intuitive. So we're going to be learning about consequentialism. We're going to be thinking about how consequences affect our actions. And then we're going to introduce the Ford Pinto case. Now, we're going to stick with the Ford Pinto case for the next few weeks. So we're on Lesson 3 right now. Lesson 4 will be about Dennis Gioia. Dennis Gioia was the field recall coordinator at Ford during the Pinto controversy. And he wrote this article, Pinto Fires and Personal Ethics, where we'll look at his own perspective on the case, why he made the decisions that he did. So we'll sort of dive deep into this aspect of the case. And then in Lesson 5, we talk about whistleblowing. This is where we introduce deontology, the second of our ethical theories. But we also ask the question, should any of the Ford engineers have blown a whistle and tried to prevent the Pinto case from getting as far as it had? So in order to ask these questions about whistleblowing for the Pinto, we're going to have to get some of the details about the case and get some of the perspectives in the case. And that's what we're going to be doing for the next couple of weeks. So we spent 3 weeks total on the Pinto case. So this first week, we're really learning what it's about. We're introducing consequentialism as a way of thinking about it. And get familiar with the facts of the case, because we'll be staying with it for a while. I also have some other reading this week. It's a pretty light lecture week. I don't say very much in the lesson, and I really just want you to dive into the material, and in particular, this Pinto Madness article, 1977, Mark Dowie article, published in Mother Jones. This is a newspaper, investigative journalism magazine. Mark Dowie's an investigative journalist, and he gets access to some of the internal documents at Ford that make the public aware of what's going on with the Pinto. And this is what sets off all the court cases and so on, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Remember, if you have any questions or comments about the lesson, leave questions in the discussion forum in the open threads. You can also come to the online hangouts where we have a conversation about this. All right, let me go ahead and jump into the Prezi. So here's my prepared presentation for this week. Yeah, Lesson 3, Ethics and Consequences in the Ford Pinto. So the first thing to talk about is the ethical theory we're introducing. It's consequentialism. So consequentialism is the view that a particular act is right or wrong, is good or bad, depending on what consequences follow from that action, right? So what happens as a result of what this person does? Consequentialism holds that everything you need to know about the morality, about the ethics of a case, are about considering the consequences that follow from the action. So if good things happen as a result of what you did, then it was a good action. And if bad things happen as a result of what you did, it was a bad action. The consequentialists aren't principled about what's good and bad in themselves. It's only about what happens as a result. It's only about the consequences, right? That's the characteristic of consequentialism. You might know this by other kinds of names. So anytime you do cost-benefit analysis, like, if you have to make a decision, you put the pros on one side and the cons on the other. This is a kind of consequentialist reasoning, right? What are the good things about this side? What are the bad things about this side? This kind of reasoning, weighing the consequences. Sometimes in a cost-benefit analysis, you can give intrinsic values. If you're deciding on majors, you might list. Yeah, this is a good example. So if you're deciding on majors, you might list the possible career options that you have in one major versus another major, the salary that you might make from one major versus another major, where the jobs are, but you might also list things like how much you like doing it, right? So that might be an intrinsic quality, not just about the consequences. But maybe it's about the consequences, about if you have that job, how much you'll enjoy being in that job. Thinking about the consequences, thinking about the results of an action, or this is consequentialist reasoning, weighing alternatives, maximizing the good. Consequentialists, this is the theory of consequentialism, is that you want to maximize the good in terms of the consequences. For many people, this is going to be a very intuitive way of thinking about what's right and wrong. Right? Did it cause something good to happen or bad to happen? But we'll see later on that there are alternative views, fairly popular alternative views. But for this week, just consequentialism. So there's lots of different kinds of consequentialism. One kind of consequentialism you might think is, you might call Machiavellianism. Machiavellianism, remember Machiavelli says that the ends justify the means. And so Machiavellianism is, the idea is that you can do anything you want in order to get the results you're looking for. Right? The ends justify the means. So it doesn't matter what you do. You might think that doing some things are immoral or even illegal, but for the Machiavellian, what really matters is that you get the results that you're looking for, and it doesn't matter how you do it. If people get hurt in the process, what matters is the results. That's the Machiavellian. Right? So that's a kind of consequentialist. It's a concern about the consequences, but it's a particular kind of consequentialism where the process of getting those consequences doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what happens in any other way except that you get what you want. Right. So let's say I want $1 million. Well, one way of getting $1 million is robbing a bank. So a Machiavellian might say, well, robbing a bank, if I do it well enough, right, if I get away with it, then I get a bunch of money. You might think stealing is wrong, but we're not interested in the right and wrong of the act. We're interested in right and wrong of the consequences. The consequences that I want are having $1 million. So the Machiavellian would say, then you should do that act because it yields the right consequences. All right, so that's one kind of consequentialism. The much more common kind of consequentialism would disagree with the Machiavellian and thinks that there's something that makes things good that we can use to judge whether one consequence is better than another, and that makes it good in a way that's independent of your particular interests. Right? So the Machiavellian is only looking after their own interests, is sort of selfish in that way. But there's a different kind of consequentialism that isn't selfish. This is called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism says that what is good, or what's the greatest good, is happiness. Happiness is the greatest good in the sense that this is what everyone wants. Even the person who robs the bank to get $1 million, the reason they want that $1 million is because they think it'll make them happy. Right? So really what they're after is happiness. And if they could find some other way of getting happy, of being happy without stealing $1 million, then they would do that instead. Right? The person who robs the bank thinks that that's the best way to happiness. And maybe they're wrong about that. Maybe it also puts them at threat of prison, and going to prison would not make them very happy. Right? So the utilitarian would weigh these things against each other and would try to maximize the good. The utilitarian principle is to maximize the good, which means maximize the total happiness. And when the utilitarian says happiness here, they're not just talking about their own happiness, they're talking about everyone's happiness. So that if the results of your action result in more people happy than not happy, then it was a good action. Not that you have to make everything perfect for everyone, but just that on balance, right? So on balance, things are no more happy than they are sad. Or the opposite of happiness for the utilitarian is usually suffering. So either you're happy or you're suffering. And so the idea is that if you perform an action that increases the overall happiness, you buy someone an ice cream cone, that increases the overall happiness a little bit, right? So that's a good action. Does it increase suffering at all? Not really. Maybe the person has health problems from eating too much ice cream, and it could get bad. But in the general case, giving someone ice cream is not a bad thing. It raises the total happiness. Killing someone on the utilitarian view, or torturing someone, maybe even worse, raises the total suffering. So those kinds of actions that raise the total suffering, not just for any one person, and especially not just for yourself, but all around. So consider all the happiness of all the people. Does that happiness go up or down from your action? And the utilitarian view is that we have a moral obligation to make happiness go up, to increase the greatest good for the greatest number, maximize happiness. Now, it's not just about your own personal happiness, and part of the challenge here is that people mean different things by happiness. What makes you happy might not make me happy. So what do the utilitarians mean by happiness? And this gets a little bit tricky. Utilitarians usually define happiness not as pleasure, not just as hedonistic pleasure, right? So the ice cream cone makes me happy, but it also, might be bad for me, might give me diabetes or something. In which case, the overall happiness is increased, right? Because I have this disease as a result. So happiness is not increased, but it feels good. Utilitarians are very clear that it's not just about what feels good, but it's about doing well. So happiness in terms of well-being, living a good life, not just a happy life. Maybe the heroin addict feels a lot of pleasure, but maybe they're not living a good life in a sense of, not just in the moral sense of that they're doing the wrong thing, but in the sense of well-being, sense of doing well, that they're healthy, that they're active and engaged in their social environment, in their world. Or you might think someone who's a drug addict might feel a lot of pleasure, but they also are not physically healthy. They might withdraw. They might have other sorts of problems. Right. So this issue of well-being, the analogy that I like to use is with a garden. You might like different flowers than me, but there's a very clear scientific distinction between whether a garden is doing well or whether flourishing, whether a garden is productive, and whether a garden is dying. Right? That's not about whether you like the flowers or don't like the flowers. I can admit that those, I can say that those flowers are ugly, but I'd still admit that it's a flourishing, well-performing garden, right? That it's active and alive, versus dead and decaying. Right? The difference between those things are not merely a matter of personal preference, but they're really a matter of the system itself. So utilitarians say maximize happiness, maximize greatest number of greatest good. That means that when people are suffering, when people are starving, for instance, or when people are tortured, this is a bad thing. These are bad actions because they increase the amount of suffering and they don't increase the amount of happiness. But helping people and charity work and this kind of stuff increases the total happiness without increasing suffering. So these are the good actions. This is the general utilitarian view, although it's going to get, for any particular action, to judge it right or wrong, you have to actually know the consequences. This is one of the challenges of the utilitarian view, is that you might not always know the consequences before you get going. Right? Or sometimes you might think of the consequences, you might think the consequences will be one thing and they end up being something entirely different. We've already seen cases like this in class, just to bring this back to engineering cases with the Millennium Bridge. Right? None of the engineers who built the Millennium Bridge expected it to wobble the way it did. Right? So this was a consequence that they weren't anticipating. And it was a bad consequence, that they had to shut the bridge down for a few years to fix it. So you might not, even an engineer on an engineering project, might not be able to anticipate everything that happens in the future. Utilitarianism is not just about doing what's best given what you know, because you might not know everything. You might be guessing wrongly. Utilitarianism is really about doing what's best, all things considered. Right? So the right actions for the utilitarian, the right actions are the ones that actually cause the greatest happiness. Not just that you intend to cause the greatest happiness, but the ones that actually do cause the greatest happiness. So you can intend to do good things and cause huge catastrophes. And on the utilitarian view, you did a bad thing. Even though you intended to do a good thing, it doesn't matter what you intended to do. What matters is what actually happened. And if a bunch of bad things happen, then that action was bad. Okay. So we can talk more about this. There's resources on Moodle. But maybe the easiest way of understanding consequentialism is with the trolley problem. So the trolley problem is it's a classic thought experiment. It's obviously an unrealistic thought experiment, but the idea is to understand how the consequentialist reasoning works. So here's the scenario: is the trolley problem. The trolley is heading down the track. If it keeps going down the track that it's on, it's going to run over 5 people. In this image, the 5 people are tied to the track, you might imagine that they're not tied. I mean, so they can't move. You might imagine they're not tied to the track, but they're just sort of standing on the track and not paying attention. So they're not. They could move, but they're not moving. They're victims. Now, innocent people are about to be hit by this trolley, but you happen to be standing on the trolley lever, and if you pull that lever, the trolley gets diverted onto the side track where there's one person. So the question is, do you pull the lever? Right? Do you divert the trolley from its existing course, going to kill 5 people? Do you divert it to hit the one person? Right, so if you just look at the consequences, if you do nothing, 5 people die. If you pull the lever, then 1 person dies. 5 is greater than 1. Right? 5 people dying is more suffering than 1 person dying. So it seems like just on the numbers game, you should pull the lever. Right? That if the goal is to create the best consequences, then in this case, the best consequences are where only 1 person dies. I mean, someone's going to die either way. I mean, it would be better if no one died at all, but given the structure of the example, because someone's going to die either way, and you have the chance to control who dies, the question is, do you pull the lever? A consequentialist is going to say, of course you should pull the lever. Look, it's 5 versus 1. The consequences just make it clear that you should pull the lever. But maybe you don't want to pull the lever for all sorts of reasons. Maybe you don't want to feel guilty about killing this one innocent person, right? Because they wouldn't have died unless you had pulled that lever. Or maybe you have some special relationship to this one person. Right? What if this one person is your mother? Now, obviously, 5 people is still more than 1 person. Your mother's a person, just like anyone else. But you have a special relationship to that person. I mean, that special relationship might make you not pull the lever, even though the consequences would be worse by doing so. Right? So it seems like your desire to save your mother in the trolley problem is a violation of the consequentialist reasoning. The consequentialists say, do whatever maximizes happiness. Saving your mom and killing 5 people would not maximize happiness. In fact, it would probably create more. I mean, all of these people might be mothers also, right? They might all have children who also become sad from their dying. And in this case, it's 5 times as many people as this one person. And so even though you'll feel really sad, a lot more people will suffer if you don't do anything. So the consequentialist is going to say, even in the case where it's your mother, even if it's the case when your mother saving your mother's life, perhaps you should pull the lever and sacrifice your mother for the greater good. So here is where it starts to be less clear that the consequentialist reasoning is the correct reasoning. Let's go through a few more of these trolley problems because the examples are great. If you go to facebook.com trolley problem memes, we have a bunch of examples of this. The standard legitimate philosophical example is the fat person. So this is an example from a philosopher back in the 70s when these arguments first came out. And the example is almost the same, right? So there's this trolley barreling down, its brakes aren't working. It's about to hit these 5 people. But in this case, there's no lever to pull for a side route. In this case, you just happen to be standing near a very large man who's in such a position that it would take very little effort for you to push him onto the track. And because you're an engineer, you calculate very quickly that he's large enough to stop the trolley, like to block the trolley and stop it in its tracks before it actually hits these 5 people. This image doesn't make that very clear, but the idea is that if you push the fat man on the tracks, the fat man will stop the trolley. The fat man will die, but it'll result in these 5 people being saved. So the question is, do you push the fat man? Now, remember, we just had the question earlier, do you pull the lever to kill this person and save these 5 people? Most people, the majority of people, something like 70% of people, say that they would pull the lever, kill the 1 person to save the 5, for the consequentialist reason, because of the simple math. But when we go to the fat man case, the fat man didn't do anything wrong. The fat man's an innocent person here. It's part of the challenge of this problem is that he's described as fat, and there's this stigma against fat people, and so there's a kind of cultural bias that suggests that maybe this fat person deserves some kind of punishment for being fat. This isn't correct at all, of course. The person's innocent entirely, but there's this stigma attached here that makes the case a little bit more complicated. But in this case, just like in the original case, there's an innocent person who will die to save 5 people. And the interesting thing is that far fewer people are willing to push the fat man onto the tracks than they are willing to pull the lever. This is a problem known as the problem of distance in moral theory. And the problem is just that the further away you are from someone, the easier it is to not consider their perspective. The closer you are to someone, if you're actually touching them, it becomes a lot harder to ignore their perspective, and it becomes a lot harder to ignore the effect that you have on their life. Right. So notice that in the original trolley problem, you never actually touch any of the people. Right. You're actually far away from all the people, and the only thing that you touch is a mechanism, is a lever, is a piece of technology. And because you're only touching that technology, you don't really feel like you're killing the person. Right. There's this distance, there's this gap, a technological gap between what you do and the consequences that result. And that gap is usually enough to make people feel morally comfortable performing the action. We'll see this next week about conformity and people's willing to listen to and be obedient to authority. That it doesn't take much to get people to do things that even they have very strong negative feelings about. Right? None of you would probably want to kill anyone, but you're willing to pull the lever, and there's enough conceptual distance. It's enough. You're not actually touching anyone, right? So there's enough distance that you can keep in your mind between what you do and what happens as a result. That you think it's okay. But in the fat person case, there's no distance at all. You have to actually touch the person. You have to actually shove the person that you're shoving to their death. Still, one person dies, just like in the original trolley problem. It's still one death. So from the consequentialist perspective, the results are effectively the same. The only difference is that you have to touch them, and so there's this emotional relationship that you have, and people usually aren't willing to bridge that emotional gap. They're not willing to actually shove the person on the tracks because you have to touch them. And the consequences here aren't just about who dies and who doesn't die, but it's also about having to live with the fact that you know that you pushed them, right? Having to, remember what it felt like to, in your arms, throw that person to their death. And maybe that's something that people aren't willing to live with. So this is how the trolley problem cases work, is that you sort of change the scenario in various ways to see how your decision-making changes. You make the decision one way or the other, and if you change little bits of the scenario, right, as if it's 5 people, if the 5 people are all serial killers, right, or if the one person is Einstein or your mother, right, right, how does that change your decision? So here's the case where there's a 1-year-old, a child, and then here's a bunch of 90-year-olds. The idea is that 90-year-olds are going to die soon anyway. Right? Do you save the 1-year-old do you kill the 1-year-old to save all the 90-year-olds, or do you let the 90-year-olds die to save the 1-year-old? How do you decide this case? I'm not saying that there are any good answers to this, or there's any clear answers to this. The point of these questions is not to give an answer, but is to sort of think about your decision-making process, right? How you weigh consequences against each other. So here's would it be more? So here, in this case, the trolley loops back around. So would it be more ethical to kill the 5 people first and let the 1 person watch all of this happen, or to kill the 1 person first and let the 5 all watch it happen? Right? These are kind of silly. In this case, there's a sick loop-de-loop on the second one. All right, so think about these trolley problems. Think about the variations of the trolley problems. Think about how you would decide in these cases. And think about what that means for consequentialism as an ethical theory. Can the consequences of an action ever decide on its own the morality? Right? Remember, the consequentialists think that it's always the consequences that matter. It's only the consequences. The alternative, just to mention it, I guess, the alternative that we'll talk about next week or in 2 weeks, is deontology. Deontology is a fancy word for duty theory, that you have certain duties or obligations to follow. These usually take the form of rules, like moral rules, like you shouldn't lie, you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't kill. When you say you shouldn't lie, or when the 10 Commandments say thou shalt not lie, the argument is not that you shouldn't lie because if you lie, things will be worse off than if you didn't lie. That might be true, but sometimes you can lie and get away with it. Consequentialists think that if you can lie and get away with it, then maybe you should lie. And the deontologists think that no, there's a principle here, that lying is wrong, killing is wrong, stealing is wrong. And it's not wrong because it has bad consequences. It's wrong because it's a bad action in itself, by itself. Right? So you shouldn't steal because stealing is wrong. Not because it'll hurt you in the end or it'll make people sad, but because stealing is wrong. So this is the debate, and we'll have a bit of this debate in a couple of weeks when we go through the other ethical theories. Right, so, yeah, okay. I'll go ahead and stop here. So thinking about the trolley problem, that's one thing to start the discussion with. The other big topic of discussion is the Ford Pinto. So let's go over some of the issues with the Ford Pinto. Here's the Ford Pinto. It's a 1970 car, Ford, 1971, 1978. Remember, 1971 to 1978, there's an economic recession during this time, and there's also an oil crisis. In fact, a few oil crises where there's big runs to the gas station, where people are in long lines to get gas. During this time, also, foreign car markets start popping up with these very cheap economy cars, especially the foreign market in Japan, in Korea, South Korea. And these cars start becoming competitive with U.S. automakers. U.S. automakers had not, at the time, cars were sort of big, bulky cars, gas guzzlers, and Ford and the American consumers really hadn't taken seriously the economy car model. So this is right when all the American car companies started introducing these economy cars, these efficient two-door gas-efficient cars. And the Pinto was Ford's entry into this market. So the CEO at the time is Lee Iacocca. It's called Lee's car because Lee Iacocca sort of put his reputation on this car. It was his idea for getting Ford on top in the car market. And what he wanted was an economy car to compete with the foreign economy cars. The rule of 2,000, so no more than 2,000 pounds, right? Had to be light, and no more than $2,000 cost. Had to be cheap. And so anything that increased the weight or increased the price was very looked at very harshly by Lee Iacocca. In fact, he sort of took this car under his wing and was very hostile to anyone who had suggestions for making it more expensive or making it way more. He had a plaque in his office, safety doesn't sell. And the idea is that, look, we're a business. The business is to make money. Safety doesn't make money. Consumers don't care about safety. This is the view at the time, that consumers do not care about safety. So putting resources into safety just takes away from the goal. The goal is to make a cheap, affordable car. And they did make a cheap, affordable car. And it was also a fire hazard. The car would explode from low speeds during rear-end collisions. The reason for this was that the gas tank was right in the back of the car, and there was nothing protecting the gas tank from the rear fender. So if you hit the rear fender from behind, it would pierce the fender would bend. If it pierced the gas tank, then the gas would rupture. If there were any sparks at all from the collision, that gas tank would go up in flames. Let me go ahead and show you a video from this. It explains the Pinto. Here's the gas. Yeah, here's the gas tank. There was no shield. It was an exposed gas tank in the back. So let me show you the video of the. Yeah. So this is a 1972 Pinto running at 35 miles an hour. 35 miles an hour is like residential speeds, almost 25 miles an hour. And it explodes in this giant ball of flames. In fact, because of the design, because of the cheap metal that they used, it would crumple the back, and the crumpling would even crumple the doors, so the doors wouldn't open. So if you were in the car and it burst into flames, you would get trapped in the car and you wouldn't be able to get out. And in fact, this happened a few times where people would get locked in these cars and burned to flames and even burned to ashes. This happened a few times, and this is part of the reason there was such a big outcry. Yeah, let's show that collision one more time. Right, so there's all the gas just exploding everywhere, and if there are any sparks in a metal-to-metal collision, this just goes up in flames. Yeah.
At Ford, a debate erupted about going ahead with the vehicle.
Sorry, that's from the video. All right, so that was a crash test done at Ford, and in fact, Ford knew that these vehicles would be unsafe. Not only did it know these vehicles would be unsafe, but it also had a patent for a part that would fix the vehicles, a little metal shield that you'd put behind the gas tank so that if there was a rear-end collision, it wouldn't puncture the gas tank. Right? It was a little shield. That shield would have, it weighed a few pounds, it was metal, and it would have cost $11 per car. They had a patent for doing it. They knew how to do it. Right? The engineers had all the things that they needed to fix this car. But it went against the company's principle, right? The corporate culture, right? The corporate stance that safety doesn't sell. So the proposal to put this $11 part on the car was turned down. $11, $65 today, for a $2,000 car. $11 that Ford was not willing to put on the car because it would have put it over its price estimate and it would have eaten into their bottom line. Now, it wasn't just that they didn't want to do this, it's that by design they made it so that they couldn't do this. So the typical process for designing and building a car like this is that you design it, you build a prototype, you test that prototype a whole bunch, and then you use the results of those testings to settle on a final design. And then once you have a final design that you know is safe, then you actually build all the parts for that design and you start mass production. But the Pinto was designed to enter into this market as fast as possible. So usually that design process takes 36 months, like a year and a half, maybe 2 years, maybe longer than that. But for the Pinto, they wanted it done immediately. So instead of running through all the safety trials, running through all the crash tests, and then producing the finished product, they did the safety testing and the production in parallel, which means that they had all the parts. They were already producing all the parts. They already had 1 million cars produced when they were starting to get these reports back from safety that the car wasn't safe. So in order to fix the problem, they would have to go back and repair all these cars. Repairing all those cars that they'd already made with this $11 part would have cost a lot of money, and it was too much money that Ford wasn't willing to do it. So in the lesson here, I give some resources for learning about the Pinto, and I encourage you to do your own research here. The Wikipedia page for the Pinto has a lot of resources to look at, and then there's the discussion of the fires and the recall. But then I also link you to this Mark Dowie article from Mother Jones. It's right here. So this is from 1977. Remember, the Pinto comes out in 1971, so this car had already been on the road for several years by the time this article comes out. And there had already been several crashes and people had died, had gone to court. But it was this article by Mark Dowie that really alerted the public to the problem and set the stage for all the court battles that followed. This Mark Dowie article, I encourage you strongly to read the whole thing. I think the quiz asks some questions about it. But the key thing that sets the public off is the Pinto memo. This is the memo that Mark Dowie found from Ford, and he exposed it in Mother Jones. There wasn't a whistleblower that I know of. I think he just got a copy of this memo and then published it in Mother Jones. And the memo talks about the reasoning that Ford had for not issuing a recall or not repairing the part. So Ford, again, knew about the problem. Its engineers knew about the problem. They discussed it several times. But when they did the analysis of whether they should fix the problem, this is what they found. They found that if you were to fix all the cars and trucks that are already on the road to put this shield in the gas tank, it would cost $11 per vehicle, and there are 12 million vehicles already on the road, so that's $137 million. $137 million in 1970s money. On the other hand, Ford estimated that if we do nothing and we just let these cars explode on the road, we're going to get sued a couple of times. And so what they estimated was that about 180 deaths would happen as a result of the design flaw. About 180 deaths and about 180 injuries projected. And Ford estimated that for each death, they would have to pay in court about $200,000. And for each burn victim, they would have to pay in court about $67,000. And if they're estimating about 2,100 burned cars at $7 per car, this totals up to about $50 million. In other words, Ford thought, okay, so we can fix the part and not let people die. Or we can not fix the part, let an unsafe car on the road, and then deal with the court battles when they come. And Ford decided, using this calculation, this is in the Pinto memo, using this calculation, Ford decided that it would be cheaper by more than half, right? It would cost almost twice as much, or more than twice as much, almost 3 times as much, to actually fix the car than to just settle in court. So for this reason, this is consequentialist reasoning, right? This is cost-benefit analysis. Ford decided that it would do nothing about the Pinto. This is a quote from the Mark Dowie article. The cost-benefit analysis argued that Ford should not make an $11 per car improvement that would prevent 180 fiery deaths per year. The member argues that there is no financial benefit in complying with the proposed safety standards that would admittedly result in fewer auto fires, fewer burn deaths, and fewer burn injuries. So instead of paying the 11 costs per vehicle, they were willing to tolerate 180 fiery deaths. So what do you think about this? Was Ford's decision ethical? Was Ford's decision, think about how Ford's decision was a consequentialist argument, and then whether it was a utilitarian argument. Does Ford's reasoning increase the greatest total happiness? Or does it just increase Ford's bottom line, right? Is it just good for Ford's financial position? Right. We link this back to the discussion last week when we were talking about the scope of ethical consideration, right? What do we consider? Whose perspective do we consider? Right? Which hats do we consider? Right. Well, when Ford is making this cost-benefit analysis, it's really only looking at the costs and benefits to themselves. Right, the $137 million that Ford would have to pay versus the $50 million that Ford would have to pay. It's not taking into account the costs for all the other people, right, for all the lives lost. Right, what is the cost of a human life? Well, Ford said it was $200,000, but does that really account for the happiness of the people who are affected? Right, is Ford's reasoning here really taking into account the full scope of the ethical consideration, or is it only taking into account their own stake in that scope? Maybe it's worthwhile to back up and say a little bit more about the time frame that this is occurring. Right, so I said a little bit, there's the gas crisis, there's an economic recession, there's these foreign competitors in the car market. There's also, before this, unsafe at any speed. Yeah, so Unsafe at Any Speed. This is a book published in 1965, so in the middle of the previous decade, by Ralph Nader. You might know Ralph Nader. He ran for president a couple of times. Ralph Nader was a consumer advocate, and this is what he became famous for, this Unsafe at Any Speed. So Ralph Nader's consumer advocate, in the 60s, he was learning that, in fact, our cars are really, really dangerous, and they kill lots of people, and at the time, car manufacturers weren't doing anything about it. At the time, seatbelts, there were no laws about seatbelts. There were no safety regulations at all. In fact, part of the trend with the cars was to make them really fashionable. So you have like the fins, sort of razor fins, and the big dashboard, the bench seats, and so on. Right, these are all chrome all over everything. These things might look nice to some people, but they're really not safe at all. And in accidents, people die all the time. So let's look at vehicle deaths. Lots of people die in car-related accidents. And when I say lots of people, let me give you a specific number for that. In 2015, in just 2015 alone, 35,000 people died in just the U.S. In the world, these numbers are even bigger. In fact, the U.S. is a lot safer than a lot of other places in the world. Let me see if I can find. Yeah, list of countries by traffic-related deaths. Yeah, so the United States, 16.6. So 16.6 road fatalities per 100,000 inhabitants. So the U.S. sees about 16.6 deaths per 100,000 accidents. You can see in some places these numbers are even higher, 36 of 100,000 accidents, 36 deaths per every 100,000 accidents in Thailand. You see a lot of 20s in some places. In a lot of these places, the infrastructure isn't great. The driving infrastructure isn't great. United States. Oh, I'm sorry. That was Uruguay. In the United States, it's 10.6. So that's pretty good given these averages here. The average in the world is 17.4, and the U.S. is 10 point something. So that's much better. Per year, 1 million people die in car accidents. 240,000 people in Africa. In the Americas, 150,000 people in car accidents every year. That's a lot of people. 1 million people dead every year in car accidents. That's a lot of people. The roadways are a meat grinder. It chews people up. And we tolerate it, right? No one thinks the cars should go away because they kill 1 million people all over the planet every year. Right? No one thinks the cars should go away because they kill 35,000 people in the U.S. every year. 35,000 people in the U.S. every year. This is the chart I really want to show you. Is that so? We're at the 35,000 deaths per year, 1 death per 10,000 people, right? Per year, and this is actually way low on the historical trend. So this goes all the way back to 1900s. Very few people died in cars because there just weren't very many cars here. But in the early explosion of cars in the late 20s and 30s, you see a lot of deaths. In fact, a lot of these deaths are not just from people in the cars, but from pedestrians and so on. It was a big problem. People died quite often, far more than they do now from cars. And then there was a big diff during the war. But then even after the war, you have what we think about as these 50s cars that they're just really unsafe. And this trend continues to these very unsafe cars. And then in this time period is where Ralph Nader's book comes out, 1965. So Ralph Nader is pointing out just how dangerous these cars are. Right? So this is the front panel of a 1957 Buick Roadmaster. Right? No airbags. If this thing gets into a car wreck, this is going straight into the faces and chests of all the people in the front row. There's nothing really to hold them in position. There's nothing to protect them from all this chrome. These cars are completely dangerous. You might sometimes hear people say that these old cars are built like a tank. Here's a crash test of a 1959 Bel Air to a 2009 Malibu. Bel Air and Malibu. Right, so that's the big tank that they built, but there's no safety features in it almost at all, right? So this head-on collision, standard crash test collision. How fast are they going? Standard front-end collision. So I'll also show you some from the inside. So you see the Bel Air it completely folds over, opens up, and the dummy inside, right, that steering column goes straight into their face. There's nothing holding them in place, and everything's just chaos inside. This car, the sides are all resistant to compression in that way, so it keeps the person fairly stable. Right, all the airbags pop up so that they have some cushion. Right, you might end up hurting your neck or your clavicle from the seatbelt and so on, but you are much more likely to survive in this car than you are in this car. You're not very likely to survive at all in this car, in this crash. So 1965, Ralph Nader publishes this Unsafe at Any Speed, where he talks about just how dangerous these cars are, just how little thinking goes into safety features on these cars. This book becomes a national bestseller in 1966, and it's on the basis of this book that federal government starts passing laws about safety for cars, for vehicles. Things like seatbelt laws start going into effect. It was because of this book. Ralph Nader...
The Institute just completed a study of how often people...
Ralph Nader is just a consumer advocate. He's just a person who cared about an issue and then lobbied government to change the laws. Back in the 60s, you could do that. Nowadays, it's not really possible for a single person to rally public support for a cause and then have it actually change government in this way. I mean, unless you're Donald Trump. But back in the 60s, Ralph Nader, as a consumer advocate, was able to get people to care about this safety issue and get laws passed to change these results. Now, this was good for the consumers. This was good for the safety of the public, the safety on the roads. But as you might expect, all the car companies didn't like it very much because it meant more regulations. It meant more things that they had to do to be in compliance with the law. It meant more parts that they had to put on their cars, and that meant the cars were more expensive, and that meant they were harder to sell. Right? So the motor vehicle industry was, they took Ralph Nader as the enemy, and they took this drive for safety as the enemy. So when Lee Iacocca here is saying safety doesn't sell, he's not just saying this because he doesn't think safety is important. He's saying this really in direct response to this political movement that's happening outside, and he takes it sort of as an attack on his business that people like Ralph Nader want safety, and so he's taken the strong opposite stance that safety doesn't sell. We don't have to concern ourselves with safety, and they didn't, and people died. So read Mark Dowie's article where it talks about some of these car accidents where people get burned alive. He talks about the corporate culture. Yeah, so here's a Ford. Let me read some of these quotes. Here's a Ford engineer that Mark Dowie interviews, who doesn't want to use his name, but he says, this company is run by salesmen, not engineers, so their priority is styling, not safety. And then he goes on to tell a story about the gas tank safety at Ford. So Lou Tubin was one of the more popular engineers at Ford. He was a friendly, outgoing guy with genuine concern for safety. By 1971, he had grown so concerned about the gas tank integrity that he asked his boss if he could prepare a presentation on safer gas tank design. Tubin and his boss both worked on the Pinto and shared a concern for safety. His boss gave him the go-ahead, scheduled a date for presentation, and invited all the company engineers and key production planning personnel. And when it came time for the meeting, a grand total of 2 people showed up, Lou Tubin and his boss. So you see, the anonymous engineer said, there are a few of us at Ford who are concerned about fire safety. But they're mostly engineers who have to study a lot of accident reports and look at pictures of burned people. But we don't talk about it very much. It is a very popular subject. I've never seen a safety agenda. I've never seen safety on the agenda of a product meeting, and except for a brief period in 1956, I can't remember seeing the word safety in an advertisement. I don't think that the company wants the American consumer to start thinking too much about safety, for fear that they might demand it, I suppose. We then asked about the Pinto gas tank, and the Ford engineer admitted, well, that's all true, but you missed the point entirely. You see, safety isn't the issue, trunk space is the issue. You have no idea how stiff the competition is over trunk space. Do you realize that if we put a Capri-style tank in the Pinto, you could only get 1 set of golf clubs in the trunk? And so the point is, about the scope of ethical consideration, right? It's what they're thinking about. They're thinking about trunk space, and they're not thinking about safety. In fact, they're almost hostile to the idea of thinking about safety. When people do try to think about safety, they don't pay them any attention. So read this, read the perspective of the engineers who are involved, what they said, what they did. Do your own research about the Pinto case. It's an extremely interesting case. Try to think about the facts right now, about the consequences of what happened. Look up the truth about how many people died, so you can make a judgment for yourself about this case. Next week, we're going to look at Dennis Joya, who was the field recall coordinator. He was the guy who was looking at these pictures of burned out Pintos and deciding whether they should make a recall. He decided against a recall, and he'll explain why he did that next week. And then we'll look at whistleblowing cases the week after that. Right? Was Ford's decision ethical? Is the kind of cost-benefit analysis they're doing ethical? Is the idea that safety doesn't sell an ethical quote? Compare the safety doesn't sell to the fundamental canons in the NSPE Code of Ethics for Engineers, where safety is a paramount concern. So what does it mean for someone like Ford to have a corporate policy that safety doesn't sell? Right? How does that corporate policy affect what all of the employees of Ford do? Right? Think about these kinds of issues. The Pinto case is a classic of engineering ethics. It's probably the one case that every single engineering, the Pinto and the Challenger explosion are covered in almost every single engineering ethics class. So this is sort of the standard stuff for the semester. So think about that. Think about the trolley problem. Think about variations in the trolley problem. I also have some optional readings here. On the one hand, I have this passage from Famine, Affluence, and Morality. So this is it's a discussion about giving away to charity and when we should give away to charity, and it relates to the trolley problem. Peter Singer is a utilitarian. He's argued in defense of utilitarian principles for a long time. And in this passage, Singer argues that we ought to give our stuff away to charity. We ought to give a lot more than we do to charity. The argument he makes, it's not in this passage, but I'll give you the argument he makes. I forget if they're blue suede shoes. There's some kind of shoes. So here's the argument. Imagine I'm standing next to a kiddie pool, like a little tiny pool, a little bit of water in it. And imagine there's some kid in the pool, and the kid is drowning, like a 4-year-old kid drowning in the pool. They're sort of taking on water. I can hear them glugging right next to me. They're nearby. It'd be no problem for me to lift that kid out of the water and save his life. Now, if that's the whole story, you might think pretty obviously that I have an obligation to save that kid, to do what I can to save the life. Right? No one else has to suffer for me to pick that kid out of the water. But here's the twist. I have a new pair of shoes that I'm wearing today, and I really like, and they're suede shoes, and suede doesn't go well with water. And if I get these suede shoes wet, they're ruined, and I can't wear them again. And I just bought them. I love these shoes, and they're really expensive. They're like $500 shoes, and I love these shoes, and I don't want them to get ruined. So when I'm looking at this kid drowning next to me, what I'm really thinking about is it worth ruining my shoes to save this guy? I don't know this kid. I don't know why I would want to save this kid. And I like my shoes a whole lot. So if I were to decide to not save this kid's life in order to save my shoes, I think most people would think that I did something immoral, that I should have taken action, and I failed to take action. Right? I failed in an obligation to save that kid. And my shoes are not sufficient reason to give up, or not sufficient reason to ignore this kid and not save their life. No amount, the shoes could be worth twice as much, 5 times as much. The kid's life is more important, you might think. No pair of shoes is as important as a child. But then Peter Singer says, well, look, you could right now give some of your money to charity, and that charity would help someone who's in legitimate need of that money, someone who might be starving, someone who whose life and death might turn on access to simple charity. Not that you have to give a whole lot, but if you give 10% of your income to charity, if you have a good job, 10% probably isn't going to be very much, and you're still probably going to live a comfortable life, and you're probably not going to be starving giving up that 10%. But that 10% of your income could end up saving the lives of a family, right? That $50 that you spend on a video game this week, you could use that same $50 to feed a family for an entire week. Which is more important, the entertainment value that you get from that $50 of video gaming, or the survival that the food that the family gets and the capacity to survive for that week? It seems like no matter how much you enjoy that video game, your enjoyment of that video game doesn't compare, right? The amount of pleasure that you get from playing that video game is a little bit. The amount of pleasure that the family gets from not starving is quite a lot. And so from consequentialist reasoning, you ought to be giving more to charity. And if you don't give to charity because you want to play that video game, you're basically making the same kind of argument as the person who doesn't want to save the drowning child because they don't want to ruin their shoes. From Peter Singer's perspective, the costs and benefits here, right, the consequences, just aren't comparable at all. Right? The minor inconvenience that you face from giving some of your money to charity is radically outstripped by the good it can do. Right, so he says, when we buy new clothes, not just to keep ourselves warm, but to look well dressed, we're not providing for any important need. We would not be sacrificing anything significant if we were to continue to wear out our old clothes and give the money to famine relief instead. By doing so, we'd be preventing another person from starving. It follows from what I said earlier that we have to give money away rather than spend it on clothes, which we do not need to keep ourselves warm. To do so is not charitable or generous. Right? It's not just a matter of being generous. It's not just that it's really good that you do it. Nor is it the kind of act which philosophers and theologians call supererogatory, an act which would be good to do, but not wrong not to do. Peter Singer is making the stronger claim. He says, on the contrary, we ought to give the money away, and it would be wrong not to do so. Right? So that there's something wrong about not giving away money that you don't really need to charity. It's wrong in the same way that not saving the kid from drowning is wrong. Is that you're failing to properly prioritize these goods in terms of how much they make people happy. And maybe those shoes make you really happy, but that child's life is worth more happiness than those shoes. Maybe your video game makes you happy, but the family's being able to eat dinner for a week is worth more than your video game. Right. So, in some sense, consequentialism here is challenging. It's challenging because it demands a lot more of us than we might think we're willing to give. Go back to the trolley problem. Yeah. Right, so consequentialist says if it's 5 versus 1, you ought to kill the 1 and save the 5, even if that one person is your mother or is someone important to you, right? Because your personal feelings don't outweigh the collective happiness, the happiness of the group, happiness of the whole. So you would have to sacrifice your mother for the greater good, and that's something that maybe a lot of people aren't willing to do because it's hard to do that, right? It's hard to give up. It's hard to make personal sacrifices for the greater good. It's very hard to do that. Maybe that explains the state of morality today, the state of ethics in our political environment. That people aren't willing to give up any personal sacrifice for the greater good. But Peter Singer is imploring us to do so. If you don't want to talk about the trolley problem directly, if you want to talk about some sort of more general ethical issues, think about Peter Singer. Let me actually, if you didn't see that already, the secret word for this week is safety. All right, let me do the last little bit. The last thing I have for your reading is to think about corporate cost-benefit analysis and when corporations act in their own interests versus the interests of the public. And the example, so we talked about guns earlier, And that conversation was really about the role that technology plays in society. But in this case, I want to use a slightly different example, maybe related, tobacco. Right? So tobacco is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Right? People make a lot of money selling tobacco products. And tobacco also kills people. Lung cancer is exclusively, almost exclusively, a tobacco-related disease, a smoking-related disease. If you're not smoking, you're probably not going to die of lung cancer. But lots of people die of lung cancer. How many people? Let me see. CDC, this is the Center for Disease Control. 16 million Americans living with disease caused by smoking. Worldwide, 6 million deaths per year. In just the United States, 480,000 deaths per year. That's 1,300 deaths every day in the United States from smoking-related illnesses. Right, so the corporations that produce and sell tobacco products are contributing to that statistic, right? They're contributing to a process that kills off 1,000 people a day, 1,300 people a day, 400, almost 500,000 people a year. Right, they're making a decision, and all the people that work for them, all the workers for the tobacco company, they're making a decision to contribute to this industry that has these consequences. Now, nowadays, there's a lot of anti-smoking sentiment. People are pretty well convinced that smoking is not healthy. You know, maybe you smoke. I should let you know that I smoked for 10 years when I was in college. I haven't smoked for about 5 years now. No, yeah, for 5 or 6 years. But I smoked in college, and I had a lot of friends who smoked also. But nowadays, it's pretty clear to everyone that smoking is unhealthy. But the reason for that is because there's been a huge campaign to educate people about the health of cigarettes. And this campaign happened in the 90s. There was a big court battle in the 90s, which is when this article was written. So this article is how do tobacco executives live with themselves? This is written in 1984. This is right before the big tobacco lawsuit in the 90s. Yeah, the Master Settlement Agreement, 1998. 1998, this was a major class action lawsuit against all four of the big tobacco companies for all of the smoking-related illnesses that caused all the people. Yeah, so they had to pay $12 million, no, $206 billion over 25 years as part of the payment. And part of this payment goes into education. All those truth out, or all those anti-cigarette ads that you see on television and magazines and so on, those are all paid for by tobacco companies because they're legally required to pay for them as a result of this major lawsuit. So this happened in the 90s when all these tobacco companies were found guilty of deceiving the public and selling them a dangerous product. And for decades, smoking has been around for a long time, but especially during World War II, the United States government was giving soldiers lots of cigarettes and sort of promoted cigarettes quite heavily. And so after the war, there was a large smoking culture in the United States. And culture was everywhere in all the advertisements, and there's all sorts of advertisements look rather disturbing to us today, right? So doctors smoke Camels more than any other cigarettes. Right? These cigarettes are doctor recommended, right? As a dentist, I would recommend Viceroys. It would be illegal to run an advertisement like these nowadays, right? First of all, you're not going to get any doctors recommending the cigarettes. It's against the profession because we know it's unhealthy. Right? Marketing to children, right? Putting children in the cigarettes. In the cigarette ads. This went all the way through to the modern day. Right? So this is an advertisement from the 90s, Joe Camel. Right? Joe Camel was designed to be cool, to be hip, to appeal to a young crowd, to get them to smoke early. and gets them addicted. The tobacco industry has known that tobaccos are addictive, and in fact, not only do they know that tobacco is addictive, but they knew that there were serious health consequences from tobacco use. And they've known about this for decades, long before the 90s. But they made a deliberate effort to, first of all, hide this research, suppress this research so it didn't go into the public, release a bunch of contrary research, like fund a bunch of contrary research to generate confusion and make it seem like maybe the medical consensus was wrong. And then just delay for years and years and years in court. So it took them until the late 90s, almost the year 2000, before they were actually able to be brought to court and tried and held accountable for all the damages they do. So this is a, let me go back to the beginning. This is 1994, the first of a bunch of trials, a bunch of hearings on the CEOs from the tobacco industries.
Go down the road, whether each of you believes that nicotine is not addictive. I heard virtually all of you touch on it, and just yes or no. Do you believe nicotine is not addictive?
I believe nicotine is not addictive, yes.
Mr. Johnston.
Congressman, cigarettes and nicotine clearly do not meet the classic definitions of addiction. There is no intoxication.
We'll take that as a no, and again, time is short. If you could just, I think each of you believe nicotine is not addictive. We just would like to have this for the record.
I don't believe that nicotine or our products are addictive.
I believe nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
And I too believe that nicotine is not addictive.
All right. Dr. Campbell, I assume that you're aware that your testimony, and you said in your testimony that nicotine is not addictive, is contradicted by an overwhelming number of authorities and associations. For example, in 1988, the Surgeon General of the United States wrote an entire report on this topic. The Surgeon General, of course, is the chief health advisor to our government. I assume you have reviewed that report?
Yes, I have, sir.
All right.
Yeah, so 1988, the Surgeon General releases a report that says, in fact, cigarettes are addictive. This is based on all sorts of research and studies that cigarettes are addictive. And it's as addictive as heroin and cocaine. It's as the health problems are just as great. They've known about this since 1988 as the Surgeon General report, but the tobacco industries themselves have known this even longer than that. But they put on the front that in fact, tobacco is not addictive, it's not dangerous, and that it's healthy because they're trying to sell the product. So in the How Do Tobacco Executives Live With Themselves, there's an interview with a lobbyist for the tobacco companies talking about what it's like to work for them and try to sell the cigarettes for the company, knowing that they're unhealthy. The person that they interviewed, the lobbyist who had lobbied for the tobacco industry for years, ends up dying of lung cancer in the course of the article. So he says they know, but they're able to sublimate it, I'm convinced, because of a similar mentality that we lawyers have. Freedom of choice is more important than anything. Well, that's not necessarily true, but it offers you a way that you can live with yourself. And the idea is that the tobacco executives say that tobacco is not addictive, and the reason they say this is because that means that it's people's free choice to smoke, and that means it's their responsibility for anything that happens, which means it's not the tobacco industry's responsibility, which means that they can't be liable in court and they don't have to pay in lawsuits or anything. Right? So the tobacco executives say that it's a free choice because that helps their financial interests, not because it's true. In fact, nicotine is incredibly addictive, and the tobacco industry does things to make people become addicted at a very early age to keep them on as customers for a lifetime, knowing that it kills them. So think about this case. Could you work for a tobacco executive? I mean, a tobacco company? Could you be an employee at a company that produces tobacco? I mean, maybe you can, and in fact, if you can, you probably will have a good job doing it because of these moral issues people who do work for these companies end up making more money, or they get paid better. But then they have to live with the fact that they know that they're killing a lot of people, right? So that's the trade-off. If you can stomach it, then maybe that's what you want to do. And maybe not just the tobacco industry, but think about the gun industry. Could you work for the gun industry knowing the consequences that industry produces? Could you work for the military? I'm sure maybe some of the students have been soldiers, put in military time. Knowing what the military does, or for engineers especially, the military-industrial complex is an incredibly attractive employment sector. Right? Aerospace engineering, all the engineers, a huge segment of the engineering work, a huge segment of the American economy goes into making military machines, making guns and weapons, bombs, planes, and stuff that kills people. An engineer would often be ecstatic to get a job at one of these companies because they're really good jobs and you would get paid really well. You'd have a great career. But it has these consequences. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have these jobs. I'm asking you to think about what it entails. The most similar case to the tobacco executives nowadays are the oil companies, which knew about climate change almost 40 years ago. Right, so just like the tobacco executives knew that tobacco caused cancer and was dangerous, oil companies today knew clearly. They had internal documents where they had done the research. Their own scientists had come to the conclusion on their own that climate change was happening, that the planet was getting warmer, and that oil was the cause. Right, that the use of fossil fuels was causing the greenhouse effect. Oil companies knew about this, but making it public would have been bad for their business. Right? Their business depended on being able to burn fossil fuels, so letting people know that this was happening was bad. So instead of alerting the public to this danger, they not only did they try to hide the research, but they actively countered the research. So for the last 20 or 30 years, you've had all these climate change deniers saying that it doesn't happen, it's not real, it's just a government hoax or a scientific hoax. But in fact, all the people that are saying this are being paid by the oil industry to say this because it's protecting their business. And the oil industry is fighting tooth and nail so they don't have to change their operating procedure because that would be really expensive. They would lose a lot of money. They don't want to do that. So climate change is something that we've ignored, and we're still ignoring it to a large extent. And it's because these industries are looking after their own interests instead of looking after the public good, public safety, public interest, public well-being, public interests. We'll talk about climate change in a lot more detail in lesson 9, I believe. Yeah, so in lesson 8, we go over the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. This is one of our big case studies. And in lesson 9, we'll go over climate change and geoengineering, look at what's happening exactly with the climate. That's everything I had for this week. That's lesson 3. I hope that helps you find your way through the material. Let me come back to the... All right, yeah, I hope that lets you find your way through the material. Thanks for listening. I will see you Tuesday during the Hangout, and I'll lecture you again next week.